our board of directors has some openings, and there are elections that are coming up this fall. So if you would be interested in that, you can look on our website for more information, and also contact our district manager for more information on how to get signed up for that to be on the ballot. And with that, pass it over to Greg. Thanks for joining us today, Greg.
Greg Taylor, my fish biologist for the Corps. I've worked for the Corps for 23 years here at the Willamette Project. So, and prior to that, I worked for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. So most of my professional career in the Willamette Basin. What I'm hoping to do today is just give you a better sense for a little bit of the history of the Willamette Project. I'm going to hopefully give you a much better sense of how it actually works. Like how do the dams actually function? We'll talk a little bit about some of the existing litigation, and we'll focus in a little bit on some specific things that we're doing in the North Santiam, and then a little bit about the future, what's kind of coming next, at least the stuff that we can anticipate at this point. So that's what I plan to do. I'm hoping that we'll have time to also talk about those things so that we can answer any questions you have about that. So a picture of Big Cliff Dam, and during the construction, you can see the diversion tunnel. Project's been there for over 70 years. You know, when people came, European people came to this part of the country, they immediately started thinking about how they would improve their lives. And a big focus of that, not surprisingly, was the river, and specifically the upper Willamette River. And, you know, a very complex, important part, just a hugely important part of our valley in terms of settlement, and been a big part of all of our lives, anybody that lives in this region. The Corps of Engineers was doing things early on out on the main stem Willamette River. And one of the first things they attempted to do was improve the navigation channel and make parts of the river navigable. And I just think about that now, and I'm just kind of blown away by it. Here's some quotes from back then: the systematic and judicious removal of snags from the channel. You think about that historic river, it was very braided, at least in sections, especially the upper parts of it. It was characterized by huge numbers of wood, snags, gravel, all this material. And so the Corps would go out there and try to make the river more navigable. But invariably, you know, look at the quote from 1892. This work, however, is but temporary in nature. Much of it may have to be done over again. And it just speaks to the power of the river, right? And how the river, you know, would then come and kind of reset things, even as we were trying to make improvements as we saw them to the channel. But it didn't stop folks from kind of just thinking in that regard. Again, just thinking of this idea of developing the land, the water, resources in the valley to ultimately live, you know, a better life. This quote from the State Planning Board in the late 30s, you know, talks about this urgent need to develop land and water resources in the valley to support more people in better overall condition. I think it's really important to paint that picture. And you know, that you got to remember, and that's, I think, too often forgotten nowadays when I talk to people about the dams, is these were really conceived, you know, almost 100 years ago. And so that's really important context, because the infrastructure we're working with and just the dams themselves were really conceived almost 100 years ago. And I think sometimes we forget that, and kind of the intent that there was for the dams when they went in place. The big driver, of course, as most folks saw it, and the primary reason to have the dams was to really try to reduce flooding impact. We call that flood damage reduction today. That's what we call it. But if there is a reason that we have the Willamette River, or the Willamette Project, it was this. It was to try to, you know, reduce flooding. Important to know, you know, our dams are not designed to eliminate flooding in the Willamette. And we've been quite fortunate since they've been in place that we haven't had huge, widespread, impactful flooding. That will happen. It could happen this winter. It could happen 10 years from now or 25 years from now, but there will be a flood that's large scale, that one that we can't hold back. And so the valley will see flooding again, although the dams have done, a pretty incredible job of minimizing that to a great extent. But this was the driver for the dams being put in place. So the Willamette Project itself was, it's driven by these regional interests. It was conceived as this multi-purpose project, again, driven by, primarily by flood, but also by, other authorized purposes. And so what ultimately got constructed was 13 dams and reservoirs, and it's, you can see there how they're distributed, or distribution over the Willamette Basin. So obviously today we'll focus a little bit more on Big Cliff and Detroit in the North Santiam Basin, but we have projects in the South Santiam, the McKenzie, the Middle Fork, the Coast Fork drainage, and over here on the Long Tom. Again, 13 dams and reservoirs. We also have 5 mitigation fish hatcheries that we operate. Historically, this navigation channel, I showed some of those pictures, a lock at Willamette Falls, and then a bank protection program. So 4 or 5 of these elements are probably things that maybe you don't think about. When you think about the Willamette Project, you probably think just about the dams and reservoirs, but these other elements are actually also part of that overall program. They have multiple authorized purposes. We sometimes refer to them as primary, secondary. I don't think that's important. I think the key here is to understand that we're authorized to do a lot of different things with these dams. Again, primary driver being flood risk management. We see that as our pass fail. And we also see it as the thing that we won't compromise for anything else. And the reason and what drives that is sort of the life safety aspect of it. In other words, we're never going to intentionally flood people to go do anything else. Doesn't matter what it is. So I just can't drive that home enough. And even in our litigation, our flood risk management is not compromised by things we're doing for fish, even under the litigation. And so I think that's just an important point for people to understand. Other things that we're able to do, other authorized purposes we have, hydropower, navigation. Again, we're not doing that today. Water quality, really important. We augment flow significantly this time of the year. Much more water out there than would have been there historically. There's a small amount of irrigation water. This is not the Klamath Basin. Irrigation is a relatively small player when we talk about the actual contracted piece that comes out of federal storage. It's quite small. Municipal industrial water supply. Recreation, of course, is huge. I always say most people know us based on our boat ramps and whether we have clean bathrooms or not. That's kind of their interaction with the Willamette Project typically. And fish and wildlife. A lot of what we do today is driven by things we're trying to do to improve the status of fish species, and specifically fish listed under the Endangered Species Act. So those are authorized purposes. The beauty of the Willamette Project is we have a lot of flexibility in kind of how we meet these, and we emphasize some of these a little bit more and some a little less, depending on the project. And that's changed over time. And I'll kind of give you an example of how the project's evolved in its water management over time. I want to walk you through kind of the nuts and bolts. So if there's one slide that you kind of need to learn to know how the Willamette Project actually manages water, this is it. So I'm not saying don't pay attention to the rest of this, but this is really key because everything I'm going to talk about going forward is driven by this. And what you're looking at here is a water control diagram. You also hear it referred to as a rule curve. You'll hear people say that a lot. And so on the x-axis here, you have the date. On the y-axis here, you have the elevation of a particular dam or project. Each dam has one of these water control diagram / rule curves. Okay. And generically, the way our dams work is they're at our low point in an elevation in December and January. So if you've ever driven out to Detroit and you see the stumps and the water level being really low, typically that's in December and January is when we're at our lowest point. As flood risk starts to decrease over time based on the hydrology that we have in this basin, we start to fill. And so we're filling relatively steeply and heavily in February. And then we start to slow that fill rate in March, April. And then the dams generally reach their high point sometime in May. They hold that for as long as they can. And then they're drawn back down in the fall. And then they reach that low point again by the 1st of December. That is the classic operation of the Willamette Project dams. And so it's really key to understand this. The other thing that's really important about this is we can violate this rule curve, but kind of only in one direction. And so what I mean by that is, let's say we had what we had, if you go back to early December of this last year in 2023, what did we have? We had 3 relatively short succession atmospheric rivers, if you remember that. And so what you saw in that particular case is when that happened, we were down at our low point to start, but we captured that water. And the way we capture that water is by releasing a lot less water out of the dam than what's coming in. And so what you'll see in that particular case, the elevation of that pool will rise up significantly. It's nothing for some of these pools during an event like that to go up 100 feet, 30, 40 feet in a day sometimes, depending on how much water's coming in and what we're releasing. So in that scenario, that's how we certainly reduce our flooding, and we can be above the rule curve for that particular time of year, for a short period of time. Then we'll bring the pool back down quickly. Okay. But what we can't do is just decide, oh, well, we'd really like to see Detroit higher in February this year, just cause. And it seems like it's kind of dry and there's not a lot of snow in the hills. Let's just store a bunch of water. We can't do that. We can stay below the rule curve. We can capture water during an active flood event, but we can't cheat this rule curve otherwise. And so that's what I mean by being able to kind of we can always be below the rule curve. We can't be above the rule curve unless we're in the actual flood fight. So important to know that, how we operate. So here's an example of how we've operated Lookout Point Dam. This black line here is the actual rule curve. And then you can kind of see how we've operated that particular dam over roughly a 20-year period. So here's where I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how the projects have operated differently over time. What I'm going to use is I'm going to use the elevation of the reservoir in relation to the rule curve as a metric to sort of track that. And you'll see what I'm getting at when I go through some of these projects, and you can see how our reservoir management has changed over time. The thing that's driven some of the changes in reservoir management over time, there's been a couple of things, but the big driver was the listing of fish under the Endangered Species Act in the late 90s. We had this picture, which is this is an upper Willamette River spring Chinook salmon. We also have upper Willamette River steelhead, winter steelhead, that are listed. We have bull trout, and we had an Oregon chub. The Oregon chub was taken off the endangered species list in 2014. First fish ever removed from the endangered species list, which is a big achievement for the Willamette Basin. But these fish have really driven us to operate our projects differently. So if you look at lookout over time, and again, here's the black line is the rule curve. This is roughly historically how we would have operated the project. And you look at the pre-listing period here in red, so 1971 through 86. I chose 15 years pre and post listing of a fish under the Endangered Species Act. And what you can see is a project like Lookout, which kind of traced the rule curve for the most part over that period of time. Post listing, we're not filling that project nearly as often on average, and we're not keeping it up as often on average. And so there's been a real evolution of passing more water downstream earlier in the year, not having as much water stored, and then ultimately not having as much water to pass out in the fall either, because we're bringing that project down quicker. And then I'll talk about the injunction specifically, but you can see under the injunction, this blue line is how we're operating today. And again, how dramatically different that is versus the rule curve itself and the historic operations pre-listing, and even even during the listing period. The Lookout Point operation has changed dramatically. Green Peter, same thing. So it's the exact same thing. Again, roughly trace the rule curve historically, post-listing in the late 90s. We're releasing more water earlier. And then under the injunction, we're doing these dramatic drawdowns of those pools, which is bringing those elevations down much earlier, and then in some cases much deeper than anything we did historically. Detroit, not so much. So here's the focus in the basin that you guys care about the most. One thing you can see that, again, at Detroit, historically, it filled and stayed full and mostly followed that black rule curve. Post listing, we are putting a little more water down the stream at key times of the year, which generally drives the elevation of Detroit down a little bit earlier than it would have historically. But it's not the dramatic departure that some of the other dams have taken. So the take home here is, yes, there have been some changes at Detroit, but they're not nearly what we're seeing in other parts of the basin. Just kind of give you a real world example of the kinds of things we think about before we ever release a drop of water out of the dam. And I want to paint a bit of a picture of the complexity associated with all this. I mean, this is, I think, a little more complicated than people realize. And so it's a little diagram that I put together to kind of talk this through. But, when we're thinking about water we're going to release, the first thing we got to think about, and the driver in the system to this day, it's still Mother Nature, right? It still starts with the weather and the water supply. So obviously, if we have an atmospheric river coming in, that's an entirely different situation than today. It's going to be 90 degrees today, no rain. It's just completely different. We're at base flow coming into Detroit, roughly 500 CFS versus 30,000 CFS coming into Detroit. So it all starts with the weather and the water. We've got the rule curve, right? We got to where are we in relation to the rule curve? What time of the year is it? Do we need to capture water for a flood? Do we need to keep the pool up? Where are we on that rule curve? That really drives what we do. We are doing a lot of different things at the dam. We're producing hydropower, so we have to produce schedules. We do temperature operations with our dams now, with the existing infrastructure. That has to be scheduled. We try to make sure that we do a great job with water quality. That means trying to minimize things like total dissolved gas. We've got recreation occurring. So we have ramps and things like that we need to be thinking about. Every year now, we have what we call special operations requests. So we're doing research, monitoring, and evaluation for fish. We have construction projects. We have maintenance things that we need to do or consider either at the dam or below the dam. We're doing a number of different operations today under the injunction for temperature control, for fish passage. All those things are part of our planning process. And then downstream of the dam, we have 32 control points that we're managing for floods. 32, not one, 32 that we're looking at all the time to try to make sure we can keep those flows below those specific control points. We have minimum flow objectives, main stem flow objectives, tributary flow objectives, some of them tied to BIOPS, almost all of them tied to biological opinions under the Endangered Species Act. And then we have downstream water users that we need to consider. We have things like algae. What's going on right now at Detroit, right? We got an algae bloom. We got toxins to consider. And then we have fish doing their thing. And we have different species that are coming in, and they all have different requirements. Each of the fish have different life history components. In other words, an adult fish does something entirely different than an itty bitty fish in the gravel. Okay? And a thing you might do for an adult fish might actually be harmful to that little fish. So what I'm trying to paint for you is that operating environment that we're actually operating in, and all these things that we're thinking about before we ever release that water out of the dam. All these things are being taken into consideration. So it's a pretty complicated and complicated dance that we're doing these days. So I want to talk a little bit about the injunction. Some of you have heard about this, some of you haven't. We signed a biological opinion, which is a requirement that we have under the Endangered Species Act. The biological opinion is kind of the set of actions that the federal government's required to take to meet their requirements under the ESA. This was for steelhead, for salmon, and for bull trout and chub at that time. The opinion was 15 years, so it was going to sunset in 2023. We were sued in 2018, and the bottom line of that complaint is that the plaintiffs that brought the suit alleged that we weren't meeting our requirements under the Endangered Species Act. And their primary contention was, you have 96 things you're supposed to do under this BIOP. You've only done 87 of them. There are things you haven't built or you haven't done on time. And so they took us to court. And the bottom line is the court ruled in their favor. And so in September 1st, 2021, the judge issued an injunction, and it ordered us to carry out specific measures to improve fish passage and water quality at the project immediately using the existing infrastructure of the projects. And so I think what's important to know about this is that it was not discretionary. We didn't get to choose. And so if there was an item, an action identified in that injunction, we had to do it. And we had to do it exactly how it was laid out. And I won't go into how that happened, but there was a group of people called an expert panel. I was actually part of it, although I was mostly in an advisory capacity that helped determine what those things were going to be. But the plaintiffs drove mostly what those things were going to be. And so we've been operating that way since 2021. We're meeting the injunction requirements first. That's what we're doing. These fall into a number of categories. Most of them are what we call operational measures. And the reason we call them operational measures is we're using the existing infrastructure. that's the key. We have that infrastructure available to us. It's the thing that we can change now. Um, and so I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. There are a few structural measures. We're building a fish facility, making some slight improvements to Big Cliff to try to reduce TDG and at Cougar Dam. But most of the things under the injunction that we're doing are operational in nature. So in the near term, again, we're using we're doing these changes to the operation to improve conditions for fish. So here's a picture of Detroit Dam, and you're seeing water come here. You're seeing water come there. What are we doing? Well, we've been doing this operation for a long time. We've been doing this particular operation at Detroit Dam since 2007, actually. And what we're trying to do in this particular picture is two things. We are spilling water for fish passage, so fish can go through. I know that looks like a hell of a drop, but it's better than going through a powerhouse. And so we have a fish passage operation where fish are being spilled out of the dam. But at the same time, we're also improving downstream temperatures. And so the way we're doing that is with mixing warm surface water with cool water that comes out of these hydro units. And that 50-50 blend gives us, roughly the right temperatures in line with what the historic conditions were in the basin. And so that's been a really good operation, really important operation, and it's worked quite well. We're doing this under the injunction as well. The types of operational measures we're taking under the injunction, they kind of come in three flavors. Spill, so there's spill, right? What we call the delayed refill. So a delayed refill is instead of filling along the roll curve, like I talked about starting in February, we actually just don't fill. And what that does is that provides fish an easier way out of the dam, at least for a period of time. We're doing that at a couple of the dams. And then the third one that you've read a lot about in the paper in this last year, and I was heavily involved with this, were the drawdowns. And we're doing drawdowns at 4 dams. The two that got the most publicity were primarily the ones at Green Peter and at Lookout Point. And I mentioned those before, but a drawdown is where we take the pool down below where we would normally be in relation to the roll curve. And what made the ones at Lookout and Green Peter especially controversial was they were way below the minimum conservation pool, the normal low point in the wintertime. And that had a number of effects in that you had increased turbidity because the river had to recut its historic channel through sediment. People didn't have access recreationally to the reservoir because we were down below all the boat ramps, et cetera, et cetera. But that was a fish passage operation. It's something we'll be doing going on into the future. But those are the three operational categories, types of operations we're doing. When you do these, if you hear a quote in the paper or you're talking to your friend and they said the Corps is a bunch of morons and it's just this stuff is easy and you should just and we should just do it and everything that we're doing is beneficial, they're full of it. Every time you take an operation, any kind of action out here at a dam, I don't care what it is, there are trade-offs. There are impacts and there are benefits. Generally speaking, people focus on one side of that equation or the other. They either are angry about the impact or they're touting the benefit. Rarely are they kind of weighing both sides of that equation. But that's kind of my job, and that's something I help the Corps kind of navigate and work through. But I can tell you this, there are no silver bullets. There are no easy operations that are universally good. There's trade-offs. Sometimes those trade-offs are between our authorized purposes. So if you draw a pool down too low, we can't produce hydropower. That impacts hydropower. So we forego a lot of hydropower production. That's a trade-off. Um, Sometimes what you do for a salmon isn't good for a steelhead, as it turns out. Sometimes the thing you do for a big salmon, an adult salmon, isn't good for a little juvenile salmon of the same species. In other words, there can be trade-offs between species, there can be trade-offs between their life histories, and there can be trade-offs between their authorized purposes, our authorized purposes. So that is the trick when you're designing these operations and trying to make improvements. You need to weigh these impacts and these benefits across the board, and then make a decision about what the best path forward is. So, under the injunction in the North Santiam, we're doing less than some of the other subbasins. It doesn't look as different as some of the other subbasins, in part because we're not doing one of the drawdowns, which are getting a ton of public interest. But the things we are doing, we're doing spring downstream fish passage, so we're spilling. And you can see here, we're doing that from mid-March through the winter. We're doing this basically as long as we can, as long as the pool is above the spillway gates at Detroit, we're able to spill water. When we drop down below that, there's a time where we're using our regulating outlets instead of our turbine units. So at nighttime, we're spilling water through a regulating outlet. That is a deep set of gates that we have down below our turbine units where we can release water, not through the spillway gates, but through these regulating outlets. So we're doing that. We try to spread spill out when we do it. That reduces the total dissolved gas downstream. And then we're managing temperatures, sometimes using a lower set of regulating outlets in the basin. So not a huge number of things. We had been doing some things in the North Santiam already prior to the injunction, and so there wasn't a lot of new stuff that we identified under the injunction in Detroit. I will tell you, I'm a bit surprised there wasn't some sort of drawdown at Detroit, but it wasn't identified as a thing to do under the injunction. So what's going to happen in the future? This is a really complicated slide, but I'll just run through this real quick and we'll just talk about Detroit. So we are just finishing up an EIS. We're also redoing our biological opinion and our consultation under the Endangered Species Act. Both of those things are supposed to finish up by the 31st December of this year. If that happens, we'll be out of the injunction. We'll be in the implementation phase of our the EIS and our biological opinion, the new one that we will have. But things that are being considered under both those processes, and they both haven't played out yet, but this is something we've released publicly as part of the EIS. The intention is ultimately to have a structure for downstream fish passage at Detroit. And you can see some of the timelines associated with that. So that process really wouldn't be in place right now as we envision it until the end of 2035. There's two phases to that. The first is what we're calling a selective withdrawal structure. So that's really a tower that we would have out there. If anybody's familiar with what structure we built at Cougar Dam, we're able to take water from different elevations of the reservoir, pass it downstream, and improve temperatures. So instead of doing that with the spillway gate and like the unit that I showed, you'd have a freestanding tower. After you build that structure, it'd actually be plumbed to this floating screen structure, we're calling it. So this is a football field sized facility that will have water, thousands of CFS go into it through a set of screens. Fish will be taken out of there, collected, and then transported downstream. So those are structures that are being considered in your basin. The good part about structures is they run 365 days out of the year. They primarily preserve your historic reservoir operations. At other locations around the basin, we're considering, and I'll point Green Peter out, we're considering more an operational alternative. And the operations have their own set of benefits, pros and cons, as I mentioned, trade-offs. But in the North Santiam, I think, just to be clear, we're going to be doing structures primarily under the new biop. So that's the future. These are very, very costly, hundreds of millions of dollars, just to kind of put that on your radar. It could be $500 million just in the North Santiam Basin to build these two structures. I'll stop there and give us a little bit of time, hopefully, to answer any questions you have. You know, how we've managed water has really evolved over time. In general, we're releasing more water downstream than we did historically, a little less so in your basin than others. You know, that'll continue. And the water management really should be driven by society at the end of the day. We're doing that with really old infrastructure that was developed 100 years ago. That limits what we can do and what we can't do. Everything we try to do has some kind of impact, has some kind of benefit. We're making trade-offs between different authorized purposes, different fish species, different life history of those fish, and this will all continue to evolve.
We do have some questions in the chat for you. The first one is about a large earthquake that we might get in sometime in the future. How would that earthquake affect the dams? What flood risks will there be during and after the earthquake?
Yeah, so we have a super robust dam safety program. I'm sure everybody's glad to hear that. What that program does is, you know, we're looking at these dams all the time and monitoring them through that program continuously with various types of inspections that go on all the time. Annually, more intensive inspections every 5-10 years, et cetera, et cetera. When we have upgraded a number of the infrastructure over the years with things like Cascadia in mind. So an example of that would be the spillway gates. All those in the Willamette, and there's 43 of them, have been upgraded at this point for better understanding around some of these things we didn't know, again, when the dams were conceived and really designed 100 years ago. Recent structures we've built, like the water temperature control towers, have been those modern standards for earthquakes have been taken into consideration, so they've all been beefed up in that regard. Everything we know about the dams and what we've learned from other large earthquakes around the world suggests that our dams will fare very well in a Cascadia type event. Obviously, if that happens this afternoon, 2 years from now, 10 years from now, we've got a system of things that we will do immediately associated with inspections and bringing people out on site, et cetera, et cetera. But everything we've been told, everything we've learned suggests that those dams will do quite well under a Cascadia type scenario.
What is the life expectancy of the dams?
I think everybody's following that there's a number of dam removals that have occurred in the Pacific Northwest. I want to draw a little bit of a distinction between those and this gets to your question, Lainey, what we have here in the Willamette. Remember what you have here in the Willamette to start with. Let's start with $4 billion of infrastructure on your floodplain. Okay, that is huge, and it's really, really critical that you know, kind of start at that place. The other thing to understand is what's actually happened with some of those dam removals, and I want to turn this into a dam removal conversation. But I think there's a very clear path that's occurred in each of those cases, and I'm talking every single one of them in the Pacific Northwest, including the recent Klamath work. Private entity, a FERC license that needed to be renewed. Huge costly upgrades for fish if they got a new FERC license. And a financial decision that was made by that private company to not invest because it just didn't pencil out economically. I'm oversimplifying that, but that really is what has happened in each one of those cases. Our case is very different. Our dams are not FERC licensed. They're not private. They're not, we operate because society and Congress has told us to operate and gives us funding. These structures, again, they've been in place in some cases in the case of, let's take Detroit Big Cliff, right? They were put in 1953, 54. So they've been around for over 70 years. They're still in great shape. Again, they're monitored continuously all the time. I guess I can't answer exactly what that is. We've had dams. Fern Ridge Dam, for instance, had some settling in it at one point about 10, 15 years ago. That's a clay dam. It was just a dirt dam. We went in there and fixed it. Presumably, if a place, and you could pick any of them, it wouldn't matter, Hills Creek, Big Cliff, Detroit, if there was an issue that was identified that needed some kind of major, dam repair, we'd work through a public process to make a decision about whether that would happen or wouldn't happen. And we operate at the discretion of the public. And so, what would that take? How much money would it cost? What's the associated benefit, impact? Do people want it? I would tell you, in the case of a place like Fern Ridge, 10 to 1, people wanted it. And in fact, the thing that we heard from the public back then was, don't build it in 2 years, build it in 1. Fix it in 1 year, not 2 years. That's the primary thing we heard. So I don't see scenarios here based on the condition of the existing infrastructure or what I know about it that we're going to see the dams removed or changed. How they operate will change and has changed and will continue to change. But I don't see a scenario where the dams will go away. So I don't know if that answered your question or not. Tried to.
Let's see, the 2019 biological opinion for the reallocation of storage in the Willamette system requires the Corps to write an annual Willamette Basin year in review report. Are these reports publicly available?
I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that we're not fully implementing the allocation yet on the ground. That is a relatively new thing. It is also influenced by what the outcome of the biological opinion is going to be for the overall operation of the Willamette Project, which is a big part of that. And so we're not there yet. I can get back to people on that. Kathy Warner, who works for us up in Portland, is the person that oversees the Willamette Basin review. So I just don't, unfortunately, know the answer to that question.
Let's see here. Is the USACE considering extending the boat ramps at the reservoirs where you're doing drawdowns?
Possibly. So we have another process that's going on right now. It's called our master planning process. More the land-based part of how we manage the projects. That's also occurring, which I know is confusing for the public because we got 10 different things happening. And under that process, they're thinking about that and considering that. I think it depends on what the long-term plan is at a particular project. Like I mentioned, if let's say we'll take Green Peter. If the long-term plan at Green Peters continue to implement the drawdown, then ultimately I think you are going to see a push to try to improve public access to some of those sites, because that's a big impact. But nothing specific yet in the works on those. And I think there was, can you explain the injunction?
Yeah, I think that came in right before your slides on what the injunction were.
Okay. Okay.
So, yeah.
If that didn't get answered, it's the outcome of litigation and a set of actions that we're required to take based on that.
Next up, we have a flood control question. Isn't flood control an encouragement for people to develop in flood-prone areas? Is it reasonable to encourage development in those areas? Wouldn't it make more sense to create greenways on all waterways for recreation? In other states, there are waterway easements that are developed for bike paths, trails, etc. If these areas are flooded, the impact is on recreation and less on property damage and human life, and recovery is faster and has less economic impact.
Yeah, Jim, I don't want to sort of get into the politics side of this, but the people, and this is why I provided a little bit of the historic context, right? The people in this basin, and I'm using that term broadly when I say that, made a decision to put these dams in place to reduce flooding. Period. And that decision has played out in a number of basins in Oregon. The Rogue, same thing. They put projects in place. Other places didn't happen, right? So it's hard now when you have the amount of development that we have. I live in Eugene. We just built a hospital on the floodplain in the McKenzie River. In Eugene, it's on the floodplain in the McKenzie River, the hospital. So this is something that the society has chosen to do. I'm not saying that I personally would have done some of this necessarily, but we're there, and it's really hard to walk back from the amount of infrastructure that we have on the floodplain. I think things that we're trying to think about that are strategic are there opportunities to do some off-channel storage of floodwaters in key locations, but you got to have a willing landowner. You got to have, and when we have looked at that, man, it's a pretty small drop in the flood damage reduction bucket, quite frankly. It's really hard to make that up. I'm not trying to deflect your question, but I think the ship has sort of sailed a bit on that in terms of how we sort of settled the valley and all these flood-prone areas. And I know there's some litigation out there with the EPA and some other folks that looks at this a bit, but it's hard for me to envision kind of moving off where we're at in this particular basin in that regard.
Thank you. Next question. On the slide with timelines, can you explain why the disposition study extends into 2027? Per WRDA 2022, the study was due in June of 2024. So just wanted to clear up that timeline.
Yeah. So the disposition study, I want to make this point, is unique to any project I've ever worked on in my entire 25 years of working for the Corps. That study is at headquarters, and it'll be released when it's released. That's all I can say about it. It's all I know about it. I don't know what's driving that. I know it's not currently being released, and folks at very high levels and a number of organizations are making those decisions. And so I wish I could give you a little more detail on that. I can't. I just really can't, and I don't. For those of the folks that maybe don't understand a few of the details, I can speak about this for a second. We've been asked to look at some of the role of hydropower in the Willamette Basin and what role hydropower should play going forward. If you don't know, the existing hydropower in the Willamette is of the power that's produced in the Columbia River system, which includes the Willamette. It's some of the more expensive power in the basin. It's a very small part of Bonneville's portfolio, only about 5%, but it is more expensive. It's going to get more expensive as we implement these fish requirements, because Bonneville pays for parts of those. So there's been a question around whether we should continue to have hydropower at the Willamette Project, what that should look like, and we authored a report, kind of talking about that. I will tell you this, it's not as easy as what you read in the paper. So what I mean by that, and this is exactly what I was thinking about when I included the slide about the pros and cons and the benefits and impacts associated with something. What you need to understand about how we use the existing hydropower program is we have a ton of things we're doing for fish. Temperature operations, fish attraction at a bunch of our adult fish facilities, reducing total dissolved gas down below our dams, let alone just what the hydro itself. So what I tell people is understand that you have a toolbox at each dam to pass water. It typically only has 3 to 4 tools in it. One of those is hydropower. If you take that away and you don't replace it with something, you just lost flexibility in how you operate your system. And so just understand what the end state will be. Here's the other end state that people I think have in their head, but it's not real. If you stop producing hydropower tomorrow, you don't have a safe fish passage route. You don't. You got a hole in the dam with a turbine unit in it, but you have no way of controlling that energy and that water coming out of there. None. So you have to make a physical modification to that route at minimum to end up with something that might pass a fish more safely. It is not as simple as just turn the hydropower unit off. Oh, safe passage. I think that's what people have in their heads. I just want to make sure you understand it's not that simple. It's going to require a major structural upgrade at best, if it can be done, to end up in that end state that I think people would like to see and have in their heads. I'm not making that decision. Nobody locally is making that decision. That decision is going to be made at a very high level. But I understand there's some frustration around not seeing the disposition study. I'm frustrated by it too. I think it should be out there. I think it would be good to get that out there, quite frankly. So.
Thank you. I think we have time for our last 2 questions. Please explain why Detroit Dam has a different management drawdown plan than other dams like Green Peter. Is it because of the recreation issues at Detroit?
No. So under the injunction, so the drawdowns were driven by the injunction operations that were developed by the court. The plaintiffs developed a set of recommendations. We worked as a small group, I mentioned this, an expert panel that worked on those then to make sure that everybody understood, how these would work or wouldn't work. And for whatever reason, a drawdown of Detroit was not identified as as important for downstream fish passage at that site by those entities. One of the reasons that would be true is that we do have the existing spillway gates and that spill operation at Detroit that's occurring. And it's been pretty successful at passing fish, actually. I couldn't tell you why that was or wasn't identified, but that tool was identified at Lookout and Green Peter and is being used. So it's really just an outcome of that process. Again, our long-term plan for Detroit is to do the fish passage through a structural method. So fish would be collected in a trap. It wouldn't be done operationally by a drawdown.
And we have one last question. What about siltation behind the dams lowering the lifespan?
Yeah, that's a good question. This comes up a lot. So it won't feel like it, but if you look at our system in comparison to the world, the Midwest, other places around, our system actually pretty sediment poor in comparison. They don't produce a lot of sediment in comparison to a lot of other places where we have dams around the world. That's an advantage to us in terms of what we see, in terms of siltation and collection of sediment in the reservoirs. Is there some? Yes. If you go to the minimum conservation pool elevation, in other words, at Detroit, that's at 1450 every winter, that normal low point. Well, guess what you see there? A lot of sediment, a lot of gravel, a lot of, why? Well, because that's where we bring the pool down to, and you transition from a river to a reservoir every year. So yes, in that one spot, in that area, you'll see this really large accumulation of sediment. At most of the dams, it's about 10 or 20 feet of physical sediment that's kind of accumulated in some of those locations. But when you look at it in the big picture and the amount of storage that we have at these dams, it hasn't been very meaningful in terms of filling them in or reduced or lost flood control capacity. It's just not been really meaningful. It's been a really small amount, the overall total. So that's not a big driver for us at this point, especially in the context of the lifetime of the dams themselves.
Concludes us for today. So, Greg, thank you again for joining us
Yeah.
and teaching us about the system that we have around us. And thank you all for joining us today as well. And we hope to see you at another event coming up soon. Bye, everybody.